We're excited to bring you AZ-500 practice exam questions in a format you can easily consume from anywhere to assess your progress and readiness. Are you ready for the exam? Let's find out. So this is the first in a series of practice quizzes, so I'll just take a moment to tell you how it works. So each quiz includes 30 questions, narrated so you can listen from anywhere. If you're watching and don't want audio, simply mute. They include questions for every AZ-500 exam domain with explanations. It's not intended to reproduce real exam questions. It's intended to make sure you know the material, and you will find these questions are no joke. They are not trivial. But this will allow you to assess your knowledge as you progress in your preparation for the AZ-500 exam. The way it works is you will see the objective domain from the skills measured at the top of the page, the question in the gray box here, the answers, the possible answers revealed below, and once the final answer is revealed, a 15-second timer giving you just a bit to think before the answer is revealed. The answer will be revealed here in the yellow box with an explanation immediately below. If the 15-second timer is too long, bump the play rate to 1.5, and then you only have 10 seconds of lag between question and answer. And if you like this format, most importantly, subscribe, hit the bell, give us a like, tell your friends, and we will make more. So let's do this. Question 1. Azure AD Privileged Identity Management supports which of the following features when users request to activate a privileged identity profile? A ticket number in ServiceNow, an explanation of why they need to activate, approval by an admin, or all of the above. Time's up. The answer? All of the above. Azure AD Privileged Identity Management actually supports all three of these options alone or in any combination you prefer. Question 2. Azure APIs can be protected by configuring permission scopes to limit access to a third-party web app, even when users consent. True or false? Time's up. The answer? True. Admins can configure permission scopes ahead of any user consent. Question 3. In the OAuth code grant flow, the user confirms consent by providing a code back to the app, entering their password when prompted, by either providing a code or entering their password, or none of the above. And the answer? Providing a code back to the app. So in the OAuth code grant flow, the user confirms their consent by entering a code into a text box provided in the browser. Question 4. Pass-through authentication is associated with which of the following identity models? Cloud-only, synchronized, federated, or all of the above? And the answer? synchronized. So since the authentication request is passed to the on-premises Active Directory, pass-through authentication is associated with the synchronized identity model, and it's very useful in a variety of situations, including those where Active Directory supports features on-prem that are not available in Azure AD, such as restricting logon hours. Question 5. Which of the following identities eliminate the need for credentials in code? Managed identities, service principals, managed identities and service principals, or none of the above? And the answer is managed identities. So managed identities eliminate the need to manage the credentials. Managed identities are essentially service principals of a special type, which are locked only to be used with Azure resources. Question 6. With Azure AD Multi-Factor Authentication, or MFA, you can automatically block authentication for users who report fraud via email to a support address. True or false? And the answer is false. Users can report fraud using a code via phone, which is 0 by default. Question 7. You can activate an eligible privileged identity profile via the Microsoft Authenticator app, via the Azure Privileged Identity app in the Azure portal, in the properties of your Office 365 profile, or all of the above. And the answer is via the Azure Privileged Identity app in the Azure portal. Activating a profile is performed within that PIM app in the actual portal and nowhere else. Question 8. You can create new users in Azure AD with the Create Azure AD User commandlet. True or false? And the answer is false. To create new users in Azure AD, you actually use the new-Azure AD User commandlet, not Create-Azure AD User. Number 9. Azure Container Registry supports Kubernetes and Docker running on third-party cloud platforms. True or false? And the answer is true. Azure Container Registry is essentially a Docker container registry, and it doesn't disallow access from clouds other than Azure, assuming the user or service authenticates properly. Number 10. Azure Update Management can patch both Windows and Linux VMs. True or false? And the answer is true. Azure Update Management supports patching both supported Windows as well as several Linux distributions. Question 11. Network security groups include a rule to allow Remote Desktop Protocol or RDP access on which port by default? TCP 22, TCP 443, TCP 3389, or none of the above? And the answer is 4, none of the above. No rule is configured to enable remote access by default in an NSG. Question 12. Physical isolation in Azure Kubernetes Service provides the highest pod density for running workloads. True or false? And the answer is false. Separate physical nodes running AKS actually result in lower pod density and greater management overhead, and typically greater cost and complexity. The potential for physical isolation is the only real advantage in that physical scenario. Question 13. The Azure Virtual Network Container Network Interface, or CNI, enables advanced networking for the following container solutions. Choose the best answer. Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS Engine, Docker containers, or all of the above? And the answer is all of the above. Azure Virtual Network CNI supports AKS, AKS Engine, as well as Docker. It works for everybody. The following are the available types of Azure resource locks. Choose the best answer. Option 1, cannot delete and read only. Option 2, cannot delete, read only, and no access. Option 3, cannot delete and no access. And option 4, cannot delete. And the answer is option 1, cannot delete and read only. These are the two resource lock types available. Question 15. The following resources support Azure Resource Firewall. Choose the best answer. Option 1, Azure SQL and storage accounts. Option 2, Azure SQL and Azure VMs. Option 3, Azure VMs and storage accounts. Or option 4, storage accounts. And the answer is option 1. Azure SQL servers and databases, as well as Azure storage accounts, support the Resource Firewall. Several other Azure PaaS services also support Resource Firewall, and it would be a good idea to be acquainted with those services that do support the Resource Firewall prior to taking AZ-500. Question 16. The standard tier of Azure Security Center is required in order to capture data on resource security hygiene. True or false? And the answer is false. The free tier of Security Center will actually also provide information on resource security hygiene. Question 17. To provide full access to the resources in an Azure resource group, you should grant only the contributor role for the subscription. True or false? And the answer is false. This was a tricky one. There's no need to grant permissions at the subscription level. The contributor role is a good idea. The subscription level is too much permission. We need to grant contributor access at the resource group. Always apply the rule of least privilege when configuring role-based access control in Azure. Question 18. You will configure a separate front door instance to route request by URL path to different backend pools. True or false? And the answer is false. URL path-based routing allows you to route traffic to backend pools based on URL paths in the request, but this can be accommodated from a single Azure Front Door instance. Question 19. Azure Monitor can be used to alert on events of interest to security operations, or SecOps. True or false? And the answer is true. Although we think about Azure Sentinel as the center for security-related monitoring, events from administrative and security catalogs of the activity log are definitely of interest to SecOps, and we can alert on those from Azure Monitor. Question 20. Network security groups can be associated with which of the following Azure network elements? Option 1, the VNet or the virtual machine NIC. Option 2, the VNet or the subnet. Option 3, the subnet or the VM NIC. And option 4, the VNet, subnet, and VM NIC. And the answer is 3, the subnet or the virtual machine NIC. Those NSGs can be associated to the Azure subnet or to the NIC, or otherwise called the network adapter, on the VM itself. Question 21. The VM vulnerability scanning feature in Security Center can also scan for vulnerabilities in open source databases on Azure VMs. True or false? And the answer is false. Only Microsoft SQL on Azure VMs is available with this feature. Question 22. You can configure Azure AD authentication for which of the following? Azure Storage Queues and Blobs. Option 2, Queues, Blobs, and Files. Option 3, queues, blobs, and tables. And option 4, queues and files. And the answer is 1, queues and blobs. This is a tricky one. Only Azure Storage Queues and Blobs support Azure AD Authentication. And you might argue, well, Azure Files supports that. And actually, that's not true. It requires Azure AD Domain Services. So if you look at the Microsoft documentation around Azure AD Authentication support for Azure Files, the documentation even says no. And you'll find a link to that page in my AZ-500 exam prep guide. Question 23. Advanced Threat Protection in Security Center can be enabled for an app service plan only if the plan is associated with dedicated machines. True or false? And the answer is true. Only app service instances associated with dedicated machines can be enabled for advanced threat protection. Security Center doesn't support the free, shared, or consumption plans with app service. Question 24. With Azure SQL, you can configure Azure AD Domain Services authentication. True or false? And the answer is false. You can configure Azure AD authentication, but Azure SQL does not support Azure AD Domain Services at this time. Question 25. Azure Disk Encryption uses BitLocker to encrypt OS and data volumes. True or false? And the answer is true. And technically, Azure Disk Encryption does utilize BitLocker for Windows distributions. For Linux distributions, they actually leverage the dmcrypt subsystem to provide full disk encryption for your various Azure Linux distros. Question 26. Certificates are stored in Key Vault as a single complex object. True or false? And the answer is false. A certificate is a complex object, but it's stored in Key Vault as 3 interrelated objects. Question 27. Shared Access Signature, or SAS tokens, can be configured to restrict access by IP address. True or false? And the answer is true. SAS tokens can restrict access to specific IP addresses or IP ranges. Question 28. SAS tokens provide root access to an Azure storage account until the key is revoked or rolled. True or false? And the answer is false. This describes shared keys. SAS tokens are limited to a specific span of time and highly configurable and recommended by Microsoft. Question 29. Azure SQL Advanced Threat Protection can scan your databases weekly to identify vulnerabilities. True or false? And the answer is true. So optionally, Azure SQL ATP will scan your databases for vulnerabilities weekly, although last I checked that was not the default configuration. Question 30. You can enforce data residency and sovereignty using which of the following? Azure Security Center, Azure Policy, Azure Storage Encryption, or Azure Automation. And the answer is Azure Policy. So Azure Policy enables you to configure an allowed locations policy to limit deployment to your approved Azure regions only. And that is the final question for quiz number 1. So if you like this format, subscribe, hit the bell, give us a like, let us know, and we'll make more. Thanks for watching.